So for reference and in preparation for tonight's discussion, here's a summary of some of the main topics that I'd like to cover. So essentially, by the end of this brief presentation, we'll touch on some topics in terms of how is capitalism defined today. Second, what's the proper balance between central state control by governments and more liberal structures of governance? Third, what are constructive methods of international cooperation today? And fourth, how can patterns of the concept mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefit impact international relations? And just as a brief disclaimer up front, there's no right answer to any of these questions, particularly if you're looking across country borders. So it'll be interesting to get your thoughts on some of the topics I'll talk about in the Q&A a bit later. So as prevalent definitions of capitalism and related theories of political economy have been either discarded or essentially fundamentally rewritten in recent decades, the trends and potential of the world economy has often followed suit. Offering useful case studies of these dynamics, Russia, the United States, China, and Central Asia have to varying extents each continued to adjust to some of the new practical realities through subtle shifts in governance. Using various alternative techniques and approaches, these countries and regions have each to varying degrees and in different formats balanced central state control of economic development with free market principles, which is my second point there. So these trends have variably been reflected in Central Asia's relationship with China, Russia, and other neighboring states. Meanwhile, the United States and other developed powers, including in the EU, have often criticized these regions for continuing methods which were prevalent during the Cold War period. Yet ironically, Washington and other Western capitals have impeded potential progress through their often hypocritical focus on ideas such as democratization, inequality, corruption, and regime change. So I'd like to start off with a little story which helps to illustrate some of these dynamics and how this balance is seen worldwide. It's great to be here in Moscow's World Trade Center today, but a few years ago, the senior management team of a leading Russian company held their investor day near another World Trade Center, the one in Lower Manhattan in the United States. And although this annual shareholder event had routinely been held in the same place for many years, the periphery of its location had recently emerged as a site of revolution in the changing shape of governance worldwide. In Zuccotti Park, right across the street from the World Trade Center, a group called Occupy Wall Street started a wave of protest actions in 2011. Originally focused on exposing injustice, inequality, and corruption in the United States, it would spawn similar events in London, across Europe, and even in Moscow in the period that followed. The Investor Day had become a major event in the annual Emerging Markets Investor Calendar, and the location near Zuccotti Park was particularly symbolic of relative changes seen over the past 2 decades. However, a lot of similar shareholder meetings are often held in New York by their peers, including Kazakhstan's Kazmunaygas, Russia's Rosneft, China's PetroChina, and other state-controlled energy companies during the course of the year. While the location of the company's Investor Day and Occupy Wall Street meetings were physically adjacent, their substance and tactics reflected distinct differences. As the Occupy demonstrations had focused on exercising verbal instruments of power, the company's meeting remained concentrated on actions that its employees had recently taken. So words versus actions. The Russian company outlined its recent steps to expand in new production regions, introduce an array of technological innovations, improve energy efficiency, and lower carbon emissions. But there was relatively little evidence that many members of the US Congress or presidential administration chose to make the short trip in order to participate in the nearby meetings with the Occupy protesters. But despite the 4,700-mile flight or 8,000-kilometer flight or essentially 20 times greater distance from the distance from Washington, the company's management team, which was based in Moscow, traveled to engage in a very beneficial dialogue with US investors. So the diversity of alternative perspectives that produced and criticized the Occupy movement also stand in sharp contrast to the pervasive disapproval amongst Western scholars and other experts regarding standards of governance in Russia, China, and Central Asia. Previewing the more adverse reviews that lie within recent books and reflecting a broad consensus among Western experts, some of the latest recent titles in the scholarly literature have referred to, I quote, chaos, violence, dynasty, and predatory regimes. So as once noted by Jack Fuller, who recently passed away just last month, these patterns follow broader trends in mainstream Western discourse by which, he said, nakedly emotional approaches to news, often involving expressions of opinion and lacking verification of factual assertions, gain both audience and credibility. The newest or most negative information, being most available to the mind, is often taken to be the most significant, when in fact it may be trivial or really beside the point. In his seminal long telegram of February 1946, a government official named George Kennan famously argued that, quote, at the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is traditional, instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. While the perspectives of leaders in Russia and the CIS have fundamentally advanced in recent decades, the West's combination of a nearly universal critical tone and continued proactive steps to encourage leadership change overseas may understandably advance a certain level of insecurity, understandably so. But today, a broad Western consensus has defined societies from this region as largely state-controlled, ridden with corruption, or both. Although that may in some ways be partially true in any country, including in the United States, recent history has exposed opportunities to build upon mutual interests in ways that are often hidden by this type of intolerance. The same week as that company's Investor Day in New York, China's then Vice President Xi Jinping gave a speech to senior US government officials and business leaders at the Marriott Hotel in Washington in February 2012. As the heir apparent to President Hu Jintao, whose term was drawing to an end, Xi's visit was closely watched in the United States and around the world. During his speech, the suggested 4 steps that the US and China could take to improve bilateral relations. In essence, each of his points highlighted not only philosophical differences with the US, but also the alternative tactics that China has taken in its approach to international affairs and investment policy, both in Central Asia and really worldwide. First, Xi Jinping noted the central importance of steadily increasing mutual understanding and strategic trust. And he quoted a Chinese saying, "Without trust, one can achieve nothing." And this essential idea captures a key insight for US analysts who have very often been confused by the reception that American leaders have received in Russia over the course of the last few decades. While Washington has historically taken proactive steps towards initiating regime change in parts of the former Soviet Union, Beijing has displayed a high level of tolerance, as particularly seen in this region. Second, Vice President Xi suggested that both parties should respect each other's core interests and major concerns. And here he actually quoted the first US president, George Washington, who once noted that actions, not words, are the true criterion of the attachment of friends. The dichotomy between China and the US's strategies for investment in foreign policy worldwide has largely centered on these two alternative approaches. The specific examples and related data in the research I've completed show how China has primarily focused on actions, most often in the form of hard investment. In contrast, the US and other Western powers have sought to cure the perceived political shortcomings of Central Asian states. It's done so by attempting to remedy professed alternative tendencies towards, again, quote unquote, chaos, violence, and dynasty in these countries. During recent US administrations, such objectives have been pursued as a strategy for waging war in Afghanistan, remained a high foreign policy priority. Third, then Vice President Xi suggested that the two parties should work hard to deepen mutually beneficial cooperation. As similarly seen in China's priorities in the former Soviet Union, he sharply focused his remarks in Washington on opportunities to increase trade, which had remained extremely unbalanced for many years between the US and China. Finally, he encouraged efforts to steadily enhance coordination and cooperation in international affairs and on global issues. At the conclusion of his remarks, he expressed hope that the United States will respect the interests and concerns of China and other countries in this region. This final point closely related to the initial suggestion for mutual understanding and strategic trust. Similar principles were also advocated by President Vladimir Putin in an executive order on foreign policy signed the day he began his third term on May 7, 2012. In beginning a section regarding the United States, his first point called for policies based on principles of equality, non-interference in international affairs, and respect for mutual interests. Mutual confidence, mutual benefit, and equality would become explicitly ingrained in Article 5 of the June 2001 Declaration on the Creation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO. Acting with other member states, Russia and China have used this international forum as an instrument for rebalancing US policies. In responding to a US strategy that has been interpreted as hostile, the forum and its members have built upon value and broadly held principles that may be deemed as reasonable. A failure of US analysts and leaders to consider these principles has often allowed Washington to disregard proposed ideas that are actually not contrary to America's interests after all. Previously, President Hu Jintao had similarly said that China hopes to work with Kazakhstan under what he called the principles of mutual respect, equality, mutual benefit, and as always, to increase good neighbor relations, deepen mutual trust, and improve cooperation mechanisms so as to deepen pragmatic cooperation in economy and trade, energy, and non-resource sectors. Echoing many of these same points and a similar tone, China's top legislator Wu Bangui told Uzbek President Islam Karimov in 2011 that future cooperation between the two countries should be based on these very same principles. The week after Chinese Vice President his speech, Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi used equivalent words in an interview commemorating the 20th anniversary of China-Kazakhstan relations in February 2012 and reiterated President Hu's commitment to these same ideals. Of course, the longevity of the Chinese economic miracle and growth, which began in the late 1990s, remains far from guaranteed, and the significance of future growth trends for its domestic economy and partners worldwide, especially Central Asia, have remained high given the sheer scale of the country's investments and trade. Among other recent accomplishments that have recently helped to reshape Eurasia, Russia emerged as the largest oil producer in the world in 2009, and no peer seemed apparent with the potential exception of Saudi Arabia. And I know there's been some changes on that recently, but there's still definitely within the top few countries in the world. But still, between 2000 and 2010, Russia and Kazakhstan grew production more than any other states. In addition to geographic proximity, China's trade and investment growth rates had inherently given the country a fundamental lead in Central Asia, while broader market trends had followed suit. So Central Asia's recent incremental trends towards developing links across Asia have not historically followed a direct or consistent path. In the years immediately preceding the dissolution of the Soviet Union and following the creation of independent states in the region in 1991, new political and economic foundations were established. These changes allowed for the initiation of dramatic shifts in government policy towards alternative models of governments, marking a new phase in Central Asian history. The senior leadership of these 5 states directed the future of their countries at a crucial juncture in their government. Amongst other fundamental choices during this dynamic period, national leaders were forced to consider the level of control that central state authority should maintain over the management of the political, social, and economic systems of the region. The balance between state and private governance offers a beneficial construct or way of thinking for addressing these various trends, despite a vast negative consensus found in Western assessments of the region's performance on these same metrics. These assessments also illuminate the relative tendency of Central Asian leaders to gravitate towards Russia and China. Each of these partner states had managed similar challenges and transitions since 1991. In turn, these mutual experiences contribute to a higher level of common understanding. In part as a result of this personal and national sense of loyalty, Kazakhstan has often stood as the last country that refrained from declaring its independence from the Soviet Union as of September 1991. In this and other examples from the transition period, Russia's ties to the region continued to have a dramatic effect on the political careers of the first national leaders in the new states of Central Asia. Throughout the early transition period, a distinguished characteristic of the leadership was the continuity of the legacy communist elite. Despite shifts in his support of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, Nazarbayev alluded to one justification for this continuity when he stated, as an important quality in every politician is predictability of his actions. I believe that President Gorbachev has this quality. Therefore, I'm very afraid of drastic changes in the upper echelons of power, which today could lead to loss of even the rather small democratic gains that perestroika has given us. Similar to trends seen in Russia, China, and the US, each of the states in Central Asia has drawn from competing historical traditions in their search for a new paradigm for governance following independence. The Soviet period marked a higher level of central control, and it initially stood as the most recent precedent. At the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the standards of communism, socialism, and a socially centrally planned economy remained in close sight. In the years that followed, the Soviet example shaped both internal developments and the external relations each country established with outside powers. As Russia faced its own transitions and choices during this period, many of the Central Asian states continued their existing models of very close ties with Russia, with Moscow. While Western observers and scholars have often focused on the continuation of Soviet precedents, alternate trends have also arisen. These liberal tendencies were initially characterized by the rise of free trade and private property. Following independence from the Soviet Union, these tendencies developed to varying degrees amongst the 5 individual states. These included independent economic activities by corporations and individuals, privatization, and increased social and economic interconnectedness through globalization. Following independence, the balance between central state control and liberal structures of governance in Central Asia often aligned with elements of the region's prior independent experiences. Some of these traditions may be traced back to the Silk Road era, a period frequently cited by regional leaders as an example of modern development in Central Asia, as well as a model to aspire toward. An early example of globalization, the Silk Road period was characterized by diverse trading relationships, both within Central Asia and across surrounding regions. Authors have pointed to this early precedent as an example of quote-unquote thin globalization, a limited number of traders with a primary set of customers consisting mainly of the elites. Hybrid corporate structures in Central Asia have often combined elements of both state-centric and market-centric behavior, similar to corporations in Russia and China. As an example, many state-owned enterprises like Kazmunaygas have listed on international stock exchanges, such as the LSE in London. While definitions vary, state-owned enterprises are defined here to include businesses in which a government maintains a majority shareholding, or greater than 50%. Despite ties to the free market and the ownership structure of these companies, they remain under a relatively high level of government oversight and regulation, which is also similar to what you see in other countries, including my own. These companies display characteristics that in some ways parallel the modus operandi of mixed economies and mature social democracies. Some studies of Central Asia have considered the link between these competing models and underlying philosophies without systematically applying the framework to a strategic analysis of these societies. Across the population of post-Soviet Central Asian states, individuals have thus faced a range of alternatives that fall between the theoretical extremes of what may be characterized as pure socialism and pure capitalism, which is again the second topic for discussion there. The resultant career and social decisions of citizens have similarly continued to pull them in alternative directions, both in keeping with proactive policy changes and implicitly through the variable market opportunities available in given countries. Traditions of the Soviet period that persisted or reinitiated in the years since independence include a high level of state authority over business across both strategic and non-strategic industries. Timothy Fry has characterized the struggle between respective ex-communist and anti-communist factions as reflective of a war of attrition over economic and political resources. He's argued that this struggle has a devastating effect on economic growth after the fall of the Soviet Union. The research and writing I've done on this topic has followed a different point of reference by often considering the methods by which states, private forces, as well as associated institutional structures have led to more constructive symbiosis rather than destructive conflict, as others have characterized. Recent efforts by Western scholars and leaders to denigrate public leaders from the region have unnecessarily perpetuated many Cold War tendencies by deepening suspicions from that bygone era. Some of my related analysis has demonstrated a range of alternative perspectives and approaches that may help to illuminate further opportunities in the future. In addition to tendencies towards centralized state control in liberal economic systems with diversified parties, some actors within Central Asia tend to follow an alternative path following independence. As the state remained dominant and new markets were simultaneously established following the breakup of the Soviet Union, members of these societies devised other methods and means of survival through, in some cases, corruption. While a comprehensive analysis of this third model is problematic due to the limited available data, these approaches mirror many corrupt tendencies at times found in Western societies as own. In the case of my own country, there's some maybe clear cuts, such as the Bernard Madoff scandal in financial markets and Enron in the energy sector, while others are more subtle, such as the perceived societal injustices highlighted by the Occupy Wall Street movement that we talked about earlier. Among the diverse pressures that define the balance of state and private forms of government within the region, influences outside of Central Asia eventually had a dramatic effect following independence. By most indications, the importance of these external influences is expected to remain high in the future, driven in part by the political and economic objectives of external states. In turn, the political, economic, and social pressures on the existing and emerging national leadership is expected to continue to shape the direction of new policies in Central Asia. Pressure from adjacent countries has remained especially relevant due to the proximity and the high level of emphasis that states such as Russia and China have placed on relations with Central Asia. In particular, Russia has often worked to maintain and revitalize many aspects of the relationship that existed during the Soviet era. After a rapid turn toward the capitalist model after the fall of the Soviet Union during the 1990s, Russia took some steps to again increase the role of the state in the second decade following independence. The country's growing economic strength and increased leverage in commodities market in recent years has helped to further empower this new momentum. Along with the direct influence that Russia exerted in Central Asia, the remnants of past Soviet policies shaped the region's successor states during the years immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union. State policy decisions made by the Communist Party leadership during the Soviet era also often mirrored many of the new initiatives implemented by Russia after 1991. While Central Asian states continue to establish their own political paths and new relationships over time, the remnants of historic linkages continue to represent a foundation on which these new states were established. Despite broad suspicions in the West regarding the intentions and influence of Russia, my related research has demonstrated the evolving similarities between Russia and Central Asia that have actually positively impacted these states. The parallels between the privatization trends and structures in the energy sector of Russia and Kazakhstan represent an important example that contrasts with most other producer regions that hold similar resources. Some competitive tensions between the neighboring powers of Russia and China, and often external states, including the US, have remained particularly relevant in the energy arena as a result of the high level of focus. Viewed from both a contemporary and a historic perspective, the literature surrounding the Great Game has been frequently invoked as a precedent for this multi-tiered competition in modern Central Asia. This potential model refers to the history of conflict between the British Empire and the Russian Empire surrounding their efforts to achieve dominance in the region throughout much of the 19th century. In addition to influence from Russia and the US, Chinese government leaders and businesses have increasingly come to stand as alternative models for Central Asia. Beyond the contribution of capital investment, The approach of Chinese companies and smaller entrepreneurs consistently reflected the principles of mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefit. Despite the high level of state control in China, Chinese merchants have added to this influence and have served as a fundamental example for capitalist trends in the region, given their close proximity and the impact of these businesses within the society. Incremental steps towards liberalization have exposed alternative trends and future opportunities. Even if external relationships often center on government ties, the region's establishment of diverse partnerships, technology transfers, and capital flows, including stock exchange listings, help encourage trends towards market-based approaches. Contrary to popular perceptions, Central Asia's partnerships with outside powers, including Russia and China, have leveraged the relative strength of each party and may represent viable solutions to a range of current dilemmas. Despite the overwhelming focus on past failures and shortcomings, several areas of accomplishment expose the potential for effective future development through cooperative approaches. In contrast to the excitement many analysts and scholars have shown for the potential drama associated with a more confrontational new great game, a range of successes from the initial decades point to alternative scenarios and opportunities. As advocated by China and Russia, policies and actions based on the principles of mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefit have allowed for a diversity of participation that has benefited all parties. And concurrent with these trends, efforts by each power to shift their focus towards development of their domestic resources has offered additional advantages for each group. Technological breakthroughs in the energy sector since 2007 have enabled these new prospects and approaches. For an overview of these opportunities, I have a few slides which demonstrate these alternative views. So this is sort of an overview of the historic approaches that we've seen, where Russia has leveraged infrastructure advantages. They have long-standing relationships and trust, whereas the U.S. and partners in Europe have more of a security emphasis following the start of the war in Afghanistan and a focus on democracy building and trying to fix some of the perceived shortcomings of societies such as corruption. And very often, similar to the Great Game approach, have looked to support energy route diversification, in other words, avoiding Russia. And in the midst of that, also there's been a decrease, relatively speaking, vis-a-vis China in terms of capital investment. So, as I've been discussing, China has really focused, and as has Russia, on the concepts of mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefits. And they've also focused on tolerance and emphasis on access to resources and then increased capital investments. So just, to finish up, I have some other things that I'd like to discuss with you, but I'd like to get some of your main ideas first. But, some potential areas of future cooperation and some, possible sources of leverage is, I've put together a short table here. So, things that Russia may provide to the U.S. can include, much more collaborative partnerships in the energy industry and a range of other diversified sector. For China, obviously the trade and demand for products and services needs some significant work, and obviously with over $1 trillion in sovereign debt, that's a major factor. And then, China has things that they may provide Russia also, as well as I've seen in many instances, is capital investment. And looking at from the other perspective, U.S. may provide to Russia a lot of emerging technologies and potential capital market access. And U.S. Similarly, China has been particularly interested in new technologies in some cases. Although there's again a reverse order on that front as well. In some cases where I've talked in recent weeks with a number of groups where there's some major leads that China's been establishing in some sectors as well. And then finally, the interest in natural resources remains. So, but again, there's a lot more I'd like to discuss with you, but it'd be great to hear your thoughts. So thanks again to the NES community for this invitation, and I look forward to your discussion here.